When we look back at England's kings, few deaths cause as much talk, horror, and wonder as King Edward II's in 1327. What exactly happened inside Berkeley Castle that September night is still one of medieval England's most chilling puzzles. Official papers say he died naturally, but whispers tell a much darker tale. A death so cruel and meaningful, it wasn't just meant to end a life, but to send a message that would last for ages. Edward Plantagenet was born to rule one of Europe's strongest kingdoms. Yet, he died a captive in his own land, left alone by his nobles, betrayed by his wife, and hated by many of his people. His time as king, filled with army failures and private scandals, ended so completely that even how he died became a weapon for his enemies. The story you're about to hear challenges everything you thought you knew about justice back then, how much power kings had, and how far people will go to wipe out a legacy they despise. The ways supposedly used to end Edward's life weren't picked by chance. They were thought out, symbolic, and meant to mirror what his enemies saw as his biggest wrongs. But figuring out what's true history from political lies here means we have to go through layers of gossip, old writings, and intentional misinformation that have hidden the truth for almost 7 centuries. What comes out is a story that shows as much about how people in the Middle Ages thought about power, personal relationships, and punishment as it does about one king's sad end. This isn't just about how a king died, but about how power can corrupt, how personal connections can bring down kingdoms, and how seeking revenge can lead to unbelievably cruel acts. As we look into the last part of Edward II's life, we'll explore not just what might have happened in that castle room, but why it happened, who was responsible, and what it tells us about a time when killing for political reasons was both an art and a statement. The truth about Edward II's death is more complicated and horrifying than the simple story of a king being removed and dying. It's a story that makes us face uncomfortable questions about fairness, personal life, and the cost of total power. Questions that are still unsettlingly relevant even today. To grasp the horror of Edward II's final moments, we first need to understand the man he was and the world that shaped him. Born in 1284 as the 4th son of the great Edward I, also known as Longshanks, young Edward grew up under the shadow of one of England's most successful warrior kings. His father had taken over Wales, controlled Scotland, and made England a strong military force. The hope was that Edward would keep this tradition of strength and conquering going. But from his earliest years, it was clear he was very different. Medieval England in the early 1300s was a society based on strict levels of power and firm expectations for kings. Kings were supposed to be fighters first, leading their armies into battle and gaining land through conquering. They were expected to be good Christians, devoted husbands and fathers who could ensure the royal family continued. Personal connections, especially those that seemed improper or bad for politics, were less important than what the crown and kingdom needed. Edward's troubles started almost right after he became king in 1307. Unlike his father, who gained respect through military wins and strong leadership, Edward II seemed more interested in his friends and fun activities than in the tough job of being king. His close bond with a knight from Gascony named Piers Gaveston quickly caused problems, not just because it was so intense, but because Edward gave Gaveston powerful roles that angered the established nobles. England's political setup in the Middle Ages relied on a careful balance between the king's power and the nobles' rights. The powerful lords expected to be asked about state matters, to hold the most important jobs, and to get favors from the king. When Edward instead showered Gaveston, a foreigner of fairly humble background, with titles, land, and influence, he messed up this basic arrangement. Gaveston was given the earldom of Cornwall, one of England's most respected titles, along with huge estates and the king's clear favor in everything. What made this situation even more explosive was the very nature of Edward and Gaveston's relationship. Writers from that time, some very critical of the king, described their bond in ways that people then found deeply unsettling. Whether their relationship was romantic, as many historians now believe, or simply an unusually strong friendship, it went against medieval ideas of how a king should act. In an age where royal marriages were for political deals and personal desires were supposed to be less important than political needs, Edward's clear devotion to Gaveston seemed to many like a dangerous weakness that threatened the stability of the kingdom. The crisis got worse when Edward's military campaigns started to fail dramatically. His father had left him with ongoing fights in Scotland, where Robert the Bruce was fighting for Scotland's freedom. Instead of quick wins that might have brought back faith in his leadership, Edward suffered a series of embarrassing defeats. The worst was the Battle of Bannockburn in 1314, where a much smaller Scottish force completely defeated the English army, capturing many nobles and severely damaging England's reputation, something Edward never recovered from. Bannockburn was more than just a military loss. It was a huge failure of leadership that showed how completely unfit Edward was as a warrior king. Medieval warfare was as much about the king's presence and inspiring his troops as it was about battle plans and numbers. A king who couldn't lead his forces to victory, who seemed unsure or weak when facing the enemy, lost not just battles, but the essential magic of royal authority. Edward's nobles started to see him not as their God-chosen leader, but as something holding back England's success and safety. After Bannockburn, organized noble opposition to Edward's rule emerged, led by his own cousin, Thomas of Lancaster. A group of powerful lords started to place increasingly strict limits on the king's power. They demanded the right to approve who the king appointed, control royal money, and essentially make Edward a mere figurehead. This conflict wasn't just about disagreeing on policies. It was about whether Edward II was even fit to rule. The situation became even more unstable with the king's marriage to Isabella of France in 1308. At first, arranged as a political alliance to strengthen ties between England and France, the marriage seemed promising. Isabella was smart, beautiful, and good at politics. Exactly the kind of queen who might have helped steady Edward's troubled rule. She gave birth to 4 children, including the future Edward III, seemingly fulfilling her main duty as a royal wife. However, Isabella's situation became harder and harder as Edward's relationships with his favorites continued to dominate court life. After Gaveston was eventually executed by angry nobles in 1312, Edward formed similarly intense relationships with other men, most notably Hugh Despenser the Younger. The Despensers, father and son, became even more powerful and more disliked than Gaveston had been, essentially ruling England through their influence over the king while gathering huge wealth and land for themselves. For Isabella, watching her husband give so much attention, affection, and resources to his male favorites while ignoring his kingly duties and his marriage, the situation became unbearable. She wasn't just a jealous wife. She was a queen whose political standing and personal dignity were being systematically hurt by Edward's behavior. The French court, where she had grown up, watched the English situation with growing alarm and scorn, seeing Edward's reign as a disgrace to royal dignity and an insult to their daughter. The breaking point came in the mid-1320s when Isabella, during a diplomatic trip to France, refused to go back to England. Instead, she began an open affair with Roger Mortimer, an English noble who was in exile and had his own reasons for wanting revenge against Edward II. Mortimer had been locked up in the Tower of London, but had escaped to France, where he and Isabella started planning what would become one of history's most successful palace takeovers. Their relationship was both personal and political. Isabella found in Mortimer the strong, decisive man she had hoped to find in her husband, while Mortimer saw in Isabella the perfect way to get back to power in England. Together, they started putting together an invasion force, gathering support from unhappy English nobles and preparing to violently overthrow Edward II. The Queen had gone from a neglected wife to the leader of a revolution against her own husband. The 1326 invasion was quick and destructive. Isabella and Mortimer landed in Suffolk with a small force, but Edward's government fell apart almost immediately. Years of anger against the Despensers and disgust with Edward's rule meant that few were willing to fight for the king. Noble after noble declared for Isabella, and Edward found himself with almost no support. The Despensers were caught and executed with extreme cruelty. Hugh Despenser the Younger was hanged, drawn, and quartered, but not before being put through extra tortures that showed the rage his rule had caused. Edward himself fled west, trying to reach Wales or Ireland, where he might find safety. But he was captured near the Welsh border in November 1326. The man who had once been one of Europe's most powerful kings was now a prisoner, completely at the mercy of those he had angered through years of bad rule. His capture marked not just the end of his reign, but the start of a carefully planned effort to completely destroy him, not just as a king, but as a man. Removing Edward II from power was unheard of in English history. Never before had a king been officially taken off the throne while still alive, and the process needed careful legal and political moves to create even a hint of legitimacy. Isabella and Mortimer, now ruling in the name of Edward's young son, the future Edward III, had to tread carefully. They needed to appear to act legally while making sure Edward could never threaten their position again. Parliament was called in January 1327. Though it was hardly a free discussion, with Mortimer's supporters controlling London and Edward imprisoned. The assembled nobles and clergy were given a clear choice: formally remove Edward II or face the consequences of opposing the new government. The charges against Edward were devastating: incompetence, failing to defend the kingdom, letting favorites rule in his place, and bringing shame to the crown. While these accusations contained much truth, the process was basically a show trial meant to provide legal cover for what was, at its core, a successful takeover. The most innovative part of the removal was its claim to represent the will of the entire kingdom, rather than simply being a palace revolution. Isabella and Mortimer insisted that they were acting on behalf of all England, nobles, clergy, and commoners, to remove an unfit king and replace him with someone capable of proper rule. This was a radical new idea for how a country should be governed, and it would have lasting effects on English rule, setting examples for Parliament's role in who became king that would reappear in later centuries. Edward's official giving up of the throne was secured through a mix of legal pressure and unspoken threats. Representatives were sent to Kenilworth Castle, where he was being held, to inform him of Parliament's decision and demand his formal surrender of the crown. The scene, as recorded by old writers, was sad. The former king, now dressed in simple black clothes, cried as he agreed to give his throne to his son. Whether this giving up was truly voluntary or forced remains a historical debate. But the practical reality was that Edward had no choice. The new government faced a major problem: what to do with the deposed king. Simply letting him go was impossible. He would always be a potential rallying point for opposition to the new regime. Keeping him imprisoned forever was politically risky and expensive. There were examples in other kingdoms of dealing with unwanted former rulers, but none that exactly matched Edward's situation. The solution they eventually chose was both subtle and dark. Edward was moved from Kenilworth to Berkeley Castle in Gloucestershire, supposedly for safety and cost reasons. Berkeley was owned by Thomas de Berkeley, a noble whose family had suffered under Edward's rule, and who could be trusted to ensure the former king remained securely confined. The choice of Berkeley was no accident. It was remote enough to prevent rescue attempts, secure enough to prevent escape, and controlled by someone with personal reasons to hate Edward II. The conditions of Edward's imprisonment at Berkeley were intentionally harsh. Gone were the comforts fit for a king. Instead, he was kept in a cell meant to break his spirit and harm his health. The psychological torment was as important as the physical limits. Edward was to be stripped not just of his crown and freedom, but of his dignity and hope. Every part of his daily life was calculated to remind him of his downfall and his complete dependence on his captor's mercy. According to some records from that time, the conditions at Berkeley were designed to slowly kill Edward while making it seem like he died of natural causes. The cell was supposedly located above the castle's sewers, exposing him to illness and terrible air. His food was poor and irregular, his bedding insufficient, and his treatment intentionally humiliating. If he died of sickness or despair, his captors could claim they were simply holding him as instructed, with no intention of causing his death. However, this slow approach to Edward's removal apparently proved too slow for those in power. By the summer of 1327, political pressures were growing for a more permanent solution to the problem of the deposed king. Rumors were spreading about possible rescue attempts, and foreign courts were starting to ask uncomfortable questions about Edward's treatment. Isabella and Mortimer needed Edward to die, but they needed his death to appear natural, or at least not obviously a murder. The decision to go from passively waiting to actively taking steps against Edward's life marked a crucial shift in this dark chapter of English history. What happened next at Berkeley Castle would become one of the most debated and horrifying events in medieval records. A story so brutal and symbolic that many historians have wondered if it could possibly be true. Yet, the evidence suggests that something truly terrible occurred in that castle cell. Something that reflected not just the desire to get rid of a political enemy, but to send a message about the consequences of breaking medieval expectations of how a king should behave. The summer of 1327 brought increasing pressure on Isabella and Mortimer to permanently solve the problem of Edward II. Foreign courts, especially in France and the Holy Roman Empire, were starting to ask pointed questions about the former king's treatment. Pope John XXII had expressed concern about Edward's well-being, and there were persistent rumors of plots to rescue him from Berkeley Castle. Even more troubling were reports that some English nobles were having second thoughts about the king's removal, wondering whether they had gone too far in taking an anointed king off his throne. The political math was brutal but clear. Edward II, alive, would always be a threat to the new government. As long as he lived, he remained the legitimate king in the eyes of many, regardless of his formal surrender. His son, Edward III, was still a child, which meant that Isabella and Mortimer's power depended entirely on their ability to prevent any return of the deposed king. They had crossed a line that made peace impossible. They had to see their takeover through to its final, no matter how dark, conclusion. The solution that emerged was typical of medieval political killings, mixing the ability to deny responsibility with strong symbolism. Edward couldn't simply be stabbed or poisoned in an obvious way. Such a death would make him a martyr and possibly spark rebellion among those who still felt loyal to the rightful royal line. Instead, his death needed to appear natural, while at the same time serving as a warning to others about what would happen if they challenged the new order. Contemporary writers, creating their accounts years or even decades after the events, provide differing stories of what exactly happened at Berkeley Castle in September 1327. Some simply state that Edward died of natural causes, overcome by sadness and poor treatment. Others hint at more sinister circumstances without giving details. But the most thorough and disturbing accounts describe a death so horrific and full of meaning that it seems designed not just to end Edward's life, but to destroy his reputation and terrify his potential supporters. The most widely told version of Edward's death involves a method of killing that was both brutally effective and deeply symbolic. According to these accounts, the former king was held down by his guards, while a red-hot iron rod was inserted into his body through his rectum, burning his internal organs and causing an agonizing death that left no external marks of violence. This method would allow his killers to claim that he had died of natural causes while ensuring that his death was as painful and humiliating as possible. The symbolic nature of this alleged execution method cannot be ignored. In medieval thought, punishments were often designed to reflect the nature of the crime, and Edward's supposed homosexual relationships with his favorites had shocked his contemporaries. If the accounts are accurate, his death was crafted as the ultimate expression of contempt for what his enemies saw as his sexual wrongdoings and his failure to embody proper masculine royal authority. The practicalities of such an execution would have required careful planning and the cooperation of many individuals. The iron would need to be heated to the right temperature, the victim effectively held down, and the act carried out with enough skill to achieve its purpose while leaving minimal evidence. This was not a crime of passion or a sudden decision. It would have been a calculated act of political terror designed to send a message about the consequences of crossing Isabella and Mortimer. The timing of Edward's death on September 21st, 1327, was announced suspiciously quickly to the new government in London. The official cause was given as natural death due to grief and illness. And elaborate funeral arrangements were quickly made to show the new regime's respect for royal dignity. Edward's body was displayed publicly before burial, reportedly showing no obvious signs of violence, which would be consistent with the alleged method of his murder. The reaction to the news of Edward's death varied greatly depending on one's political stance. Isabella and Mortimer expressed appropriate sadness while privately celebrating the removal of their biggest threat. Supporters of the old regime whispered about murder, but didn't dare speak openly. The common people, who had suffered under Edward's bad rule but still had some respect for royal authority, were confused and troubled by the rapid series of events that had seen their king removed, imprisoned, and dead within less than a year. What makes the story of Edward's death especially chilling isn't just how brutal the alleged method was, but the cold calculation it represents. This wasn't a crime committed in anger or desperation. It was political murder raised to the level of performance art, designed to destroy not just a man, but the very idea of him. The symbolism was as important as the practical result, serving notice to anyone who might challenge the new order about what they could expect if they failed. The immediate aftermath of Edward II's death showed the careful planning that went into this final act of his tragedy. Within hours of the announcement, messengers were sent throughout England carrying the news to sheriffs, nobles, and church leaders. The speed and coordination of this communication suggested that the death had been expected and prepared for, rather than being the sudden, natural event the official accounts claimed. Berkeley Castle itself became a carefully managed crime scene. Thomas de Berkeley, the castle's owner, immediately distanced himself from any responsibility for Edward's death, claiming he had been away from the castle at the crucial time. This convenient absence was almost certainly planned beforehand, giving Berkeley a believable excuse, while ensuring that someone with enough authority was there to oversee Edward's final moments. The other people present at the castle, guards, servants, and officials were either sworn to secrecy or eliminated as potential witnesses. The preparation of Edward's body for public display was another key part of the cover-up. Medieval embalming techniques were basic, but they were enough to preserve a body for the several weeks needed to organize a royal funeral. More importantly, the embalming process would destroy much of the internal evidence of the alleged torture, making it nearly impossible for anyone to challenge the official cause of death by examining the remains. The funeral itself was a masterpiece of political showmanship, designed to demonstrate Isabella and Mortimer's legitimate grief while strengthening their authority as protectors of royal dignity. Edward's body was carried from Berkeley to Gloucester Cathedral with proper ceremony, drawing crowds of onlookers who could see for themselves that the former king showed no obvious signs of violence. The elaborate tomb built for him, which still stands today, proclaimed him as a legitimate king who had died naturally, not as a murder victim. Perhaps most telling was how those directly involved in Edward's final imprisonment were treated. Within months of his death, several of the guards and officials at Berkeley Castle met suspicious ends themselves, some dying in accidents, others disappearing completely, and still others being found dead under circumstances that suggested they knew too much about what had truly happened. This systematic removal of witnesses represents the final stage of the cover-up, ensuring that the truth about Edward's death died with those who had seen it. The broader political consequences of Edward's death played out exactly as Isabella and Mortimer had planned. With the former king permanently removed, opposition to the new government collapsed. The young Edward III was crowned with proper ceremony, but real power remained firmly in the hands of his mother and her lover for several years. Their rule seemed secure, justified by the removal of an incompetent king and the installation of what appeared to be a more effective government. However, the very brutality that made Edward's murder politically effective also contained the seeds of Isabella and Mortimer's eventual downfall. The whispered stories about what had really happened at Berkeley Castle created a hidden current of disgust and fear that gradually weakened their power. Many who had supported Edward II's removal began to question whether they had unleashed forces too dark and dangerous to control. The line between necessary political action and unforgivable cruelty had been crossed, and the new regime's moral authority was permanently damaged. The international reaction to Edward's death was quieter than might have been expected, partly because most foreign courts were relieved to see England's political crisis resolved, and partly because the official story of natural death was hard to challenge without solid evidence. However, private letters between royal courts reveal considerable suspicion about the true circumstances of Edward's end. And this suspicion affected England's diplomatic relationships for years to come. Most importantly, the young Edward III learned lessons from his father's fate that would shape his own approach to being king. As he grew older and started to assert his own power, he showed none of his father's weakness or indecision. His eventual overthrow of Isabella and Mortimer in 1330 was swift and decisive, suggesting that he had learned both from his father's failures and from the methods used to destroy him. The brutality that had eliminated Edward II ultimately created the conditions for its own punishment. The question of whether Edward II was really murdered in the horrible way some old writers describe has fascinated historians for centuries. The evidence is conflicting and driven by political motives, making definite answers impossible. What we can say for sure is that powerful people wanted Edward dead, that he died under suspicious circumstances while they held him, and that the official explanations were designed more to protect those who did it than to reveal the truth. Some modern historians argue that the entire story of Edward's brutal murder was made up later to make Isabella and Mortimer look bad after their own downfall. According to this idea, Edward might have died naturally or been killed in a more common way, with the horrific details added later by writers who wanted to emphasize the evil of the usurpers. The symbolic nature of the alleged execution method, so perfectly designed to reflect medieval attitudes about Edward's supposed sexual wrongdoings, does seem almost too perfect to be historical fact. However, other evidence supports the darker interpretation of events. The systematic removal of witnesses, the careful management of Edward's death scene, and the political advantages that his murder provided to Isabella and Mortimer all suggest that something more sinister than natural death occurred at Berkeley Castle. The fact that similar execution methods were used in other medieval political murders adds credibility to the accounts, even if the specific details may have been exaggerated over time. Perhaps the most convincing argument for the murder theory lies in the political logic of the situation. Isabella and Mortimer had committed themselves to a course of action that made Edward's continued existence impossible. They had removed an anointed king, seized power in the name of his young son, and eliminated Edward's supporters through execution and exile. In such circumstances, allowing Edward to live would have been not just politically dangerous, but suicidal. They had gone too far to turn back. The method allegedly used to kill Edward, if true, shows a level of psychological cleverness that speaks to the medieval understanding of power, shame, and symbolic justice. This wasn't simply murder, but a carefully crafted statement about the consequences of breaking societal rules. Edward's supposed homosexual relationships had shocked his contemporaries, and his death was designed to reflect and punish those wrongdoings in the most brutal way possible. What makes this case particularly disturbing is how it mixes personal revenge with political necessity. Isabella's reasons weren't purely political. She had been personally shamed by Edward's neglect and his clear preference for male favorites over his wife and queen. The alleged method of his execution suggests a level of personal spite that goes beyond mere political calculation, reflecting the rage of a woman who had been systematically demeaned and ignored by the man who was supposed to honor and protect her. The lasting impact of Edward II's death reaches far beyond the immediate political results of 1327. The story, whether real or a legend, became part of English folklore and political awareness, serving as a warning about the dangers of weak kings and the consequences of breaking social norms. It set examples for removing kings that would reappear during later constitutional crises, particularly during the English Civil War and the eventual execution of Charles II. The case also reveals the medieval connection between personal relationships, power, and a king's right to rule in ways that are still uncomfortable and relevant today. Edward's downfall wasn't just about his failures as a military leader or administrator. It was about his perceived failure to embody proper masculine authority and his apparent preference for relationships that went against contemporary social expectations. His death, real or imagined, was designed to punish not just political incompetence, but sexual transgression. For modern audiences, the story of Edward II's death brings up tough questions about what historical truth really is, and how political spin can shape our understanding of the past. The accounts of his brutal murder might be factual records of a horrific crime, or they might be later inventions designed to justify the actions of his son, Edward III, and make Isabella and Mortimer look bad. The truth might be forever lost in the complicated world of medieval politics and propaganda. What remains clear is that Edward II's fate serves as a stark reminder of the costs of political failure in a time when power was personal, absolute, and unforgiving. Whether he died naturally, was murdered in a common way, or suffered the brutal end described by the old writers. His death marked the end of one of the most tragic reigns in English history, and opened a new chapter in the long fight between royal authority and noble resistance. The shadow cast by Edward II's death went far beyond his own lifetime, influencing English politics and royal behavior for generations to come. The mere possibility that a king could be not just removed from power, but murdered in such a brutal and symbolic way, fundamentally changed the relationship between ruler and ruled. No longer could kings assume that their divine appointment protected them from the ultimate consequences of political failure. The example had been set that even anointed royalty could face death if they sufficiently angered their subjects. Edward III, who inherited the throne as a result of his father's removal and death, learned these lessons well. His reign became one of military glory and efficient rule, marked by victories in France and Scotland that brought back English prestige and showed the kind of warrior kingship his father had so clearly failed to provide. Whether consciously or not, Edward III's success represented a systematic rejection of everything his father had stood for, proving that the Plantagenet line could produce effective rulers when guided by the harsh lessons of Edward II's failure. The political changes that came with Edward II's removal, especially Parliament's involvement in taking a king off the throne, and the claim that such actions could represent the will of the entire kingdom, set constitutional precedents that would echo through English history. The idea that being king was conditional upon effective rule, rather than being an absolute divine right, took root in English political awareness and would eventually contribute to the development of constitutional monarchy centuries later. Isabella herself, despite her initial success in getting rid of Edward II, ultimately paid a heavy price for her part in his death. When Edward III came of age and asserted his own power, one of his first acts was to arrest and execute Roger Mortimer, while confining his mother to comfortable but permanent retirement from politics. The official charges against Mortimer included the murder of Edward II, suggesting that even the new king believed his father had been murdered rather than having died naturally. The international effects of Edward's death were equally significant. Other European courts noticed how quickly and completely an established king could fall when he lost the support of his nobles and his people. The brutal efficiency of Edward's elimination served as both an inspiration and a warning to other rulers facing internal opposition, showing that in the medieval world, political failure could have the most extreme personal consequences. Perhaps most importantly, the story of Edward II's death became ingrained in English culture as a warning tale about the dangers of weak leadership and inappropriate personal relationships. Whether the horrific details of his alleged murder were true or not, they served a powerful symbolic purpose, reinforcing social norms about masculine authority, royal duty, and the consequences of breaking established expectations. The story became part of the shared unconscious of English political culture, shaping attitudes toward leadership and authority for centuries to come. The mystery surrounding the exact circumstances of Edward's death has proven to be as politically useful as the death itself. The uncertainty allows each generation to interpret the story according to their own values and political needs, making Edward II's fate a kind of historical Rorschach test that reveals as much about those who tell the story as about the events themselves. Medieval writers used it to justify the actions of Edward III. Reformation writers used it to criticize papal interference in English affairs. Modern historians debate it as a question of evidence and interpretation. What cannot be disputed is that Edward II's death marked the end of one of the most tragic and informative reigns in English history. His story serves as a reminder that in the medieval world, personal and political failure could have consequences of unimaginable brutality. Whether he died naturally, was murdered in a common way, or suffered the horrific fate described by contemporary writers, his end represents the ultimate price of political inadequacy in an age where power was personal, absolute, and utterly unforgiving. The final lesson of Edward II's death may be that the truth about historical events matters less than the stories we tell about them. The accounts of his brutal murder, whether factual or made up, served important political and social functions for those who told them. They warned of the consequences of weak kingship, reinforced social norms about appropriate royal behavior, and provided justification for the actions of those who came after. In this sense, the story of Edward's death became more powerful than the death itself, shaping English political culture in ways that extended far beyond the walls of Berkeley Castle and the brief life of one failed king. Today, nearly 7 centuries after that September night in 1327, we still grapple with the questions raised by Edward II's fate. How far can political opposition legitimately go? What are the proper limits of resistance to authority? When does necessary change become inexcusable cruelty? These questions, as relevant now as they were in medieval England, ensure that the dark story of Edward II's death continues to resonate with modern audiences, serving as both historical lesson and timeless warning about the nature of power, its uses, and its terrible consequences when it goes wrong.